Welcome to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers, for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love with man's best friend. Episode 5, our top 5 tips for developing structure with our dogs. I want to talk about the next subject, isolation training, independence training, crate training, den training. There's so many words for isolation training. But in essence, what we're trying to teach the dog is to be separated from us against their will, because there might be realistic times that this might have to happen, right? Let's say you have a guest over who doesn't like dogs. Let's say you're having Thanksgiving dinner and you're scared that the dog might jump on the table and steal some cranberry sauce. Or let's say, you're having a bunch of guests over and you're scared that the door might be left open, right? So we need to be able to house our dogs or place our dogs in places where that they can be safe, relaxed, and sometimes not involved in everything that's going on in our household. So isolation training is really teaching our dogs independence and teaching them how to entertain themselves when we're not available to entertain them in real life.
Yeah, and isolation training goes so much deeper than a lot of people think. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, everything that you just said is 100% true. It's very beneficial from time to time to crate your dog. I just had this conversation the other day with one of my board and trains that goes home in like a week.
Mm-hmm.
And, they were asking the questions, well, what do I do if this happens or that happens? And I was like, well, listen, if you're busy, if it's a party, put him away. Why risk him bolting out of the door and having all these
Mm-hmm.
issues? Certainly, if you have the time and you want to actively address it, then bring him out, workplace or work, whichever command we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But crating your dog or otherwise separating your dog certainly has benefit to it, but it goes further than that. The thing about isolation training or crate training, or that gives it that extra bit of benefit that people don't readily understand in most cases, maybe you'll agree with me,
Mm-hmm.
is a lot of issues with dogs, a lot of the more serious issues, reactivity, territorial, even kind of overexcitedness, dogs that lack boundaries, and when it's not in a negative sense. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the dog is very comfortable when they're around you, which is great, but they don't know how to be comfortable when they're not around you, which is not so great. It's
Right, which leads to overprotection, separation anxiety, things like that.
Yeah, it's like an obsession. It's great that that we're around each other, we can enjoy each other, but when we don't have that healthy sense of separation, I want my dog to be happy all the time. And in the real world, I'm going to be gone. I mean, people work, people have school and things like that. So the dog needs to know how to be comfortable whether you're around or not.
Right, 100%. And you were touching base on it a little bit, but I think the sometimes guilt kind of gets in the way of this form of structure, right?
Right.
People feel bad because we'll explain why people feel bad. You
Well,
know, I'm sorry. Let me just recap that real fast.
go ahead.
Sometimes people feel bad because the times that our dogs we are home. Let's say we do work a lot, or we are at school a lot, or we're busy throughout the day. We want to spend as much time with our dogs as possible. And so what happens is this idea of when we're home, actually isolating our dogs away from us, even in the name of practice, sometimes doesn't really feel necessary, right? So I totally get that, and I have a lot of empathy and understanding for people of this perspective. But always what the indirect problems that could happen if you don't teach dogs this is that dogs wouldn't learn, as Mariano said, how to cope with you actually leaving or being away from you for certain periods of time.
Yeah, one thing that you touched on earlier that I just wanted to reiterate because it was in regard to leash walking, but it's true of isolation training is
Mm-hmm.
working a dog's physical state definitely helps adjust them mentally. So if a dog, everybody or most trainers I would say rather have dealt with those dogs that are like really anxious in the crate. We've dealt with a few, you put them in there and they like salivate and whimper and dig and spin, and when you start working commands like downs and and just teaching them protocol that would help them relax, because of course mentally and emotionally they're super wound up and you can see it and
Mm-hmm.
you can hear it,
Mm-hmm.
but physically you're asking for stillness.
Mm-hmm.
Over time their body kind of comes to a happy medium somewhere, and then it just gets calmer and calmer with practice.
Right. Right. And that's the big thing. It does take practice. And a lot of times it's hard for people to get over the initial whine, cry, bark, trying to break out of a crate or ripping down the puppy pen or the baby gate.
Right.
And so in situations like that, it's, again, there's so many solutions in the books that we could give you guys on how to do this, but just understand that being able to comfortably isolate your dog or separate your dog from you and the family on occasion, is super important to the dog's mental health. And also it provides you guys with a whole different level, another option, right? I can't explain enough how many people who don't have this option, and it's so simple to develop. I even had, one of my trainers, when she first started with me, she has 2 dogs, and one of those dogs would come to work every day. And her first week, I noticed that she just let the dog kind of walk around everywhere. And I was like, excuse you, what are you doing? And she's all like, well, she gets bored and she whines. And I said, well, has she ever been trained to be away from you? And she goes, well, she hangs out at my apartment all the time. And I said, okay. And does she whine or cry there? And she's like, no. And then I was all like, so when you leave her at home, she doesn't whine or cry. And I said, so what would happen if we left her behind this baby gate in the laundry room? Well, we did it, and the dog started whining, barking, and crying. So now all of a sudden, she's just like, oh my God, no, I don't want to leave the dog there. And I said, okay, I'm going to teach you how to train this. Understand your dog doesn't whine, bark, or cry when you leave the apartment, because your dog understands that you'll come back. Your dog understands that everything's going to be okay. You've trained her from the time she was little that mommy comes, mommy goes. But now that your dog is at work with you, your dog wants to be with you because it's a new environment. She gets bored. She wants to interact with you. She gets jealous that you're interacting with other dogs, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to teach her the same skill to be separated from you occasionally, even when she's at work, right? So now her dog can spend time in this area for 1, 2, 3 hours in her shift. Then she goes and takes the dog for a walk, and the dog sleeps like a baby, relaxes, chews on a bone, hangs out, where the first initial week, drooling, salivating, crying, whining. And luckily we were able to get over that cap. But sometimes the hardest part for people is to get over that hump of the whining, barking, crying, trying to escape.
Right. 100%.
Right. Cool. So that's isolation training, guys. We do recommend tip number 2, make sure you isolate train, den train, crate train, confinement train, whatever you call it. It all means the same thing. Teach your dog to be separated from you occasionally. And also teach them to like it with toys, food, and some fun puzzles and games. Okay. Thank you for listening to the Dog Trainers Podcast, a podcast created by dog trainers for dog trainers, or anyone who's ever fallen in love